Hey guys, it's Jay. This Sunday is Father's Day, and that got me thinking about my dad and the reasons for taking on this weight loss challenge. This is only my second Father's Day without him, and while I can remember a lot of great times together, mostly what I feel is the loss. It was August 12th, 2010. I was sitting at my desk just after noon when I got the call. It was a member of my dad's work crew, and he said I should get home because my father had collapsed at the side of his house. He said the paramedics were there, and they thought it was his heart. I remember standing in my office. I took the pencil from behind my ear, a habit I picked up long ago from watching my father work as a carpenter. I could feel a switch in me as the worried sun sank deep into my chest, and it sounds funny, but the part of me that's the interviewer took over. I could hear myself asking about his heartbeat and about his breathing. I asked if he was conscious. I asked about my mother. Each answer made me wince and grip my pencil harder, and my questions were short. That drive to Glace Bay from the radio station is a blur. As I'm on the highway, I start to call the family. My brother lives in Fredericton, and for a second I debate whether to call him before I really know what's going on. I quickly realize I'd kill him if he tried to manage me like that if our roles were reversed. And as I was about to call him, the phone rang in my hand. It was my parents' neighbor on her cell phone, and it sounded like she was at a circus. It took me a moment to realize that she was outside. I could hear the paramedics. I could hear my mother. I questioned her like I had questioned the first caller. She didn't know I already knew. Knowing that she's a pharmacist, I asked her more questions, and the more detail I got, she just kept insisting that I drive safe and meet the ambulance at the hospital. That hadn't occurred to me. Up until that point, the car was on autopilot. I was driving to my parents' house. I was driving home. At the hospital, I parked the car sideways by the emergency doors and ran around the corner. I could see my mother standing on the inside of the automatic doors, rubbing her palm up and down her thigh as she was bent over with pain and worry. When she spotted me, her face lit with a sad relief. She cried into my chest as she said, "We're losing him today." And the words hit me like a wall because I really didn't know what was happening. Not 20 minutes earlier, I'd been sitting at my desk with a fresh coffee in my hand. Now my mother was a puddle in my arms, and I wasn't sure where my father was. The rest I remember in flashes. They're like Polaroid pictures that haven't quite developed. I was walking into the doorway of a small room, crammed with 6 chairs, a corner table, and a yellow hospital phone. The table was stacked with some Reader's Digest magazines. Michael Jordan was on the cover of the one on top. The doctor didn't look at me, but I could see the sweat on his forehead. My eyes searched his face with the hope that I could be sure of this news just a second before my mother. I thought that second would make all the difference, that maybe I could react and pull myself together fast enough to be there as she heard the words she feared for as long as I can remember. Before the doctor could speak, the nurse who was with him reached out and touched my knee, and as she folded in her bottom lip, I knew. If my father was still alive, the stranger wouldn't be touching me. I talked to my brother once on the way to the hospital and once after I was there, but before I knew that Dad had died. I let go of my mother's hand, which was squeezing with a strength I thought arthritis had taken from her years ago. I excused myself to call my brother. I lean on the messy sheeted ambulance stretcher in the emergency entrance. There are 3 drops of blood on the pillow, perfect circles, like colored-in thought bubbles. The imprint of his head is still there. I place my hand in the center, and I tell my brother we'd lost him. Prepare yourself. That's what the nurse said as we walked to the door of the trauma room. They had to leave the air tube in his mouth with the tight elastic stretching back his cheeks into a forced grin. His upper lip was stained with blood, almost purple against his skin. His face was damp. A white blanket was pulled up past his shoulders. His arms were straight down by his sides, jammed against the bed rail bars, and his eyes were closed. And then it was just the 3 of us. In a large trauma room with 2 beds and counters full of supplies, it was completely quiet. The metal squeaked each time my mother turned on the examination stool she sat on by the head of the bed. She talked to him. She talked to me. I stared at him in disbelief. I reached my hand through the bed rails and pulled his fingers loose from the blanket. He had the dark-skinned hands of a man that worked hard. He had short fingers on small, thick hands. I took his hand in mine and waited to feel a grip I knew wasn't coming. I rubbed his warm hand in mine to keep it from going gray and cool. In this next flash, the nurse that had touched my knee was standing beside me at the back of the trauma room. She's not touching me, but she's close. Her presence is hugging me as I watch a parade of families show up and all do the kind of shock stutter step one does when they see what they expected to see, but their body isn't prepared for the jolt of reality that hits you when you see the truth yourself. In that moment, I look at a large clock at the front of the room. It's likely the clock the doctors looked at as they officially called my father's death. I looked at it now, just more than an hour later, and I have the strangest of thoughts. As I remember it now, I think I can hear it on a radio somewhere, but I'm not really sure. Our mind does funny things. But standing there under that clock, it occurred to me that since I had left the station so fast, it was likely they had copied my 12 o'clock news into the 1 o'clock news. This was the last newscast I recorded as a guy whose father was still alive. The voice that I remember hearing through the radio that day was the voice of a guy who had no idea about the call he'd get in his office a few minutes later. He didn't know that he'd be holding his father's cooling hands through a bed rail an hour later. The most difficult part of losing Dad was knowing that it didn't have to happen. Had he made better choices, he might still be with us. My mom might not be a widow. On the flip side, I may have never found the motivation to take back my own life. Dad was a big guy, and his heart gave out. I learned a lot from his death, though. The sad part is I'm closer to him now than ever before, and that will always be my regret. We were very different people. We never saw eye to eye. He was always cautious, and I was always taking some risk that he saw as unnecessary. He was funny, very dry. He was a kid his entire life. He loved kids. He'd talk like Donald Duck, give them a nickname, and then make them call my mother Mary Witch. The older I got, I started to realize that he was born to be a grandfather, and I'm sad he never got the chance. We fought over the things fathers and sons fight about. He was a quiet guy with a temper that I knew how to bring out. I never picked up the phone to call him just to see how he was doing. I never stopped by his office just to see if he wanted to grab lunch. 2 weeks before he died, he stopped by my apartment. We sat on my back deck, drank a beer, and talked about our family. We talked about how for 3 years we'd been trying to get the same time off for vacation and how we wanted to rent a bungalow to just get away. As he was leaving, I had a pang of guilt, realizing, as sons always do at some point, that their parents gave up a piece of themselves to raise you. If I had been a better son, if I had made better choices, maybe he could have owned a bungalow or a place to escape to. Maybe he wouldn't have been sitting on my back step, 57 years old, wishing for something better. Not 5 minutes after he pulled out of my driveway that day, my phone rang. It was Ma. Dad's sister had been rushed to the hospital. 3 days later, I'm standing in my parents' living room in a house my dad had built, tying a black tie around his neck as we get ready for her funeral. He had lost sisters before, and each time he lost a piece of himself, but this one was different. It seemed bigger. It was probably the first time I looked at my father and saw a man who was getting older. I was glad we were getting closer. I was glad we were finally getting to know each other as men. 2 weeks later, I'm holding his hand through the bed rails and saying goodbye. I put my hand on his head, and his gray-white hair, softer than I'd imagined. It always looked like wire reaching out of his toolbox. I realized I hadn't held his hand in more than 20 years. It was the first glimpse of what I've since come to accept, that there is no death without regret. There are 1,000 things that I would do differently now. His death inspired me to live. It took me a couple of years to put the pieces together, but in his death, I saw a certain future. Keep living the way I was, keep eating the way I was, and be prepared to leave without ever getting the chance to say goodbye, and with years of life left unlived and a family broken. This Father's Day, I honor his memory with thanks. The most important lesson of my life came with his death, but I'd give the world to be doing it with him instead of because of him. Happy Father's Day, Dad.